Today on the iPower podcast, it's my great pleasure to welcome Rob Sullivan to the show. Rob has an interesting life journey. He has been an options trader, has been in business, he still is a consultant coach, helps people with being more effective and more powerful in the world of commerce. His new book is called A Trek Within, and it's a set of stories, ways to sort of see those things that we might otherwise not examine. And of course, that's what we're all about here at the Eye of Power. So Rob is able to share very, very well his bunch of his stories and experiences that really encapsulate what I consider a lot of wisdom. So it's great pleasure to welcome Rob Sullivan to the show. Welcome to the Eye of Power podcast. I'm your host, Tom Dardick. But this podcast is not about me. It's about you and your power. It's time to claim yours. Being a digital nomad and doing that for 3 years, how has that changed your viewpoint, how you look at things, or has it, first of all? And if so, how would you say, Rob?
Historically, I got into a lot of, being interested in living in Europe and whatnot, because I've been very active in the couch surfing community. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's a
No,
travel
not at all.
website. It's like Airbnb, except for there's no money that changes hands. So it's a pay it forward, network. It's a beautiful community. And I've hosted almost 1,000 people from 72 countries or something like that. And so I've gotten very comfortable with other cultures. In fact, I realized that was one of the reasons when I left Chicago, because, I love Chicago. I grew up there, but I felt like I was going out, I was having the same conversations with the same people, going to the same restaurants, seeing the same bands. And, it was fun, but it wasn't like, when I would host couch surfers, I'd get exposure to all these different cultures. And I really enjoyed that. And the great thing about Europe and bouncing around there is that, you can get on a train and in an hour you can be in any number of different countries. You just don't have that in the US. You get on a train in Chicago and in an hour you're in a cornfield, almost no matter which direction you go, you know.
Exactly. Yeah. I was in Italy earlier this summer, and I was so impressed by the trains and how easy it is to just pop on there, and it makes it easy.
Yeah, I love Eurail. The trains are amazing. Yeah, it's a great way to travel.
It is. You kind of forget. I mean, if you can get out of the habit of it, we Americans love our vehicles, right? We love to get on the road, and sitting in traffic is like, why do I like this?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, I
Because I
just
can
have to
stop
remind.
when I want to.
Yeah. Well, but now, the shifting perspective is, you get into a long TSA line and I have to remind myself, this is my commute. And thank goodness I don't do it every day.
Yeah, I hear you there. I know.
Uh,
When I was a kid, I thought by now that it would be easier to get around the world. I thought, okay, by the time I'm 50 or 60, I'll be able to practically teleport between continents. And it's like, it's worse now than it was then.
yeah, yeah, that's true. Thanks to terrorists, idiots.
I know. Or our reaction, terrorists plus our reaction to them, I'd say both those those factors.
Yeah, exactly. The false sense of security that, somehow, they're going to attack the same way twice, and that, now we're protected. Nonsense. Uh,
That's a maybe a good segue into getting into the kind of your area of expertise in the world. And what, of course, the Eye of Power podcast is about our personal power. It's about what are the things that help our agency and what are the things that sort of keep us from being the fully, expressed version of ourselves. So that's the thread that connects all of the podcast episodes together. So somebody with your expertise, I think we can maybe pull a few of the layers off and really get into that. And maybe that's a segue, Rob, into getting into why might that be? Why do we? I mean, intellectually, we know that what you just said is true. I've never had an argument with somebody that says, "Oh, they're gonna hijack our planes and run them into buildings." as soon as we let our guard down. Nobody really thinks that, but yet we go to so much hassle. So what do you think that's about? What can you comment on that as far as the human condition?
I certainly don't pretend to be an expert in that area, but my sense is that people just like to feel like they're secure. And even if it's a false sense of security, people will willingly subject themselves to searches and going through some metal detector and taking their shoes off and doing all kinds of things that in the end are not going to make that much difference. I have a close relative who was a pilot for an airline, and she often talked about how, they have to be careful about people who bring, multiple people who come on board and, with various components of, for example, like bomb making material or whatever, and, watching people, are the certain same people going back to the bathroom at the same time? Are they, building something, there? And it's sad that we have to worry about stuff like that, but, and the idea that we can protect ourselves against every eventuality, I think is, unfortunately, it's not going to happen. If somebody's hell bent on attacking us, it's gonna, they will. In the meantime, everybody else is unfortunately willing to give up their freedom for this false sense of security. I mean, you look at this stuff that goes through TSA. I mean, there's, the acronym is, thousands standing around. They're not even police. They don't even have authority. Now you go through, like, I think it's Munich. You don't have to take your computer out of your bag. You don't have to take your, you can go through with a water bottle. There's, it's that I hope that we evolve more to a sense of normalcy like that. But when I have to take out, like I had an ice pack, I had surgery a couple months ago, and I forgot to pack my ice pack, and because I usually just do carry-on stuff, but I forgot to put it in the checked baggage. And they confiscated this, great thing that I've loved. And I haven't seen another one since. I haven't really looked either. But I looked at the guy and I'm like, who are you protecting? And I asked him, I said, at least, is there, this is in London. I said, is this going to go to get donated to, a shelter that could potentially use something like that? He goes, no, it's all going to get thrown out. Okay, who are we protecting and why?
Yeah. No, it's I mean, of course, everything is a trade-off, right? One of the things I think is we humans tend to want to believe in solutions and magic and shortcuts and tips that are going to make our lives simpler and easier and get us to the promised land quicker. And I don't know about you, Rob, but my experience is that the promised land is a path that is done by the incremental. So the things it's the little things that we either do or don't do that make the big difference in a compounding way over time. And I don't know much in the way of shortcuts or that sort of thing. What do you think about that notion?
Yeah, I love where you're going with that because it's the little things, that's I can't remember the progression, but there's something about, like what you think about, you act on, what you act on, becomes what is a habit, basically ultimately creates, who you are in your personality, and I'm not getting that exactly right. I'm sure you probably heard the thing that I'm going through, but I love that, that idea that, if you're doing something repetitively for good or bad, it's going to take you in a certain direction, but you have to move, like I have a friend who's a shaman, and she often says, when you take the first step, the universe meets you more than halfway. And I love that idea. Yeah, because when you have to take action, I have yet to see anybody who's been sitting on their hands on the sofa, where magic happens. The magic happens when you put yourself out there and you do the other cliche that I like around that is, when you leap, the net will appear. I think about a time in my life where I quit a job, not knowing what was next, not knowing where my next paycheck was going to come from. And it took me like 6 months to pull the trigger and do this. It was not a good fit for a whole number of reasons. And it was really interesting because the next morning, literally, I sent in my resignation at 6 o'clock on a Thursday. And I'd been on the phone with my attorney, and she said, why do you want to work with these jerks? That's not the word she used, but you get the idea. And I said, I started thinking about it. I said, you're right. I don't, because we had been trying to work on a consulting arrangement, or something afterwards. And I'm like, that doesn't even make sense. I don't like these people. I don't want to work with them. And so, I was a bit terrified, but I'm like, you know what, I just need to let go and I need to trust and I need to do this. And so I did. 6 a.m. the next morning, I got an email from a client I hadn't heard from in about 2 years. And he said, Rob, we've been thinking about you. We've got a coaching engagement that would be, we think you'd be the perfect person to do this. And, it's not going to happen until the fall, but we're really excited to talk to you about it. And the next, when I called them back and we talked about it, I don't remember if it was because of my sudden availability or what, but thank goodness it all got moved up and that whole engagement paid for my next 6 months. So where I was, literally worried where the money was going to come from in 2 weeks, I left that situation feeling like I had been leaning up against the door of abundance, trying to keep it shut,
Uh,
because I had been, swimming upstream for so long and living in that fear of, what if I do this? Is that going to work or whatever? Yeah, things work out.
wow.
You just have a
I, I
way.
love I love that story. And it reminds me of so many different things, like the idea of, I mean, when you leap, the net will appear. So you were able to act out of a courageous place, not out of one that says, okay, yeah, I hate this circumstance, but I'm just going to take the paycheck. And um, almost always when we do that, in retrospect, it tends to not be worth the money typically, right?
Yeah,
We,
exactly.
we, we
I,
we tend to
yeah,
overvalue the money in that sense.
well, and we overvalue the security. When
Yeah.
my first job was working at Leo Burnett in advertising, and I remember when I realized that that wasn't the right thing, and I went on. My next move was to become an options trader at the Board of Trade because that's a really good next logical step. He was like a mentor. He was one of the people who had recruited me. He had heard through the grapevine that I was leaving before I had ever announced it, and he pulled me into his office and he said, talk to me about this. And I thought he was going to give me a really hard time, like, how can you do this? It's such a great place. Because I thought he was Mr. Leo Burnett. I thought he would be the, chairman someday. And he looked at me and I'll never forget. He said, Rob, he said, I wish I could do what you're doing. He said, but I have a wife, I have a couple of kids on the way. He had adopted some children and whatnot. He said, I'm not in a position to do that. And what was interesting was 3 months later, he was part of the very first layoff Leo Burnett ever had. And it sent him ultimately to Argentina and a whole bunch of other places. And, it was probably the best thing that ever happened to him. But I don't get the feeling it was a step he would have taken on his own because, I mean, well, Burnett was a great place, but even in that moment, I could tell that he wasn't entirely happy there. For him to look at me and say, I wish I could do what you're doing, but I can't, tells me that's a trapped feeling. That's not an empowered place.
Sometimes it does take some sort of an event to come along. And one of the things about life is events are going to come along in one form or another. So,
Yeah.
uh, sometimes we do need a wake up call and so forth. I want to circle back to what you were talking about with the relationship between our thoughts and our actions, and a little bit of that psychology. In the Eye of Power model, it's maybe too small to see, but the vertical axis here is action and attitude. So it's the axis between, our what we perceive, what we think, our cognition, and then what our behaviors actually are, and that spectrum of how they're related to each other. And that forms the vertical axis from what I call the power grid. Whatever we think and do is either going to be focused inward or outward, and that forms the horizontal axis. So it's really describing what's the playing field of our agency, our power.
Mhm.
And so, but it starts with that, I think, that vertical where it's our perceptions. And in the world of psychology, there's different models and beliefs of how things play out over time and how we develop as human beings. But there's pretty universal agreement that it's our beliefs, however they get there, that determine how we take our limited sensory information that we get in the world. We're not omniscient beings. We see a very limited perspective about what's true in the world. And then that sensory information is then translated into some sort of narrative perception. And that translation is profoundly affected by whatever those beliefs that we give weight to. We say it's real. So back to what we're talking about with security, we think that if I don't have a irregular paycheck, I might starve, I might die, I might be kicked out of the social club, I might, my friends won't respect me. All these sorts of things that are in there that end up shaping our perceptions and thus determining what our behaviors are and thus what our fates are. I say all that as a prep to explore in your work and your personal life, because as somebody who's a digital nomad, travels the world. I mean, that's a pretty glamorous sort of situation to be in. A lot of people would love that kind of freedom and the ability to experience more of the world. Not everybody, but a lot of people. So I think people would see somebody like yourself, Rob, and say, "Man, how did that guy do it?" Or "What could I do to get there?" So all of that to say, I want your thoughts as I'm talking about this topic of what your perception is along those lines.
Yeah, I love where you're going with that. I wish I could put a USB port in my forehead and just download it, because there's so many different moving parts that I'm trying to think about the best place to start. Um, the key
We
thing,
got time.
yeah, okay,
We'll take it one
okay,
thing at a
fair
time.
enough. The key part is that this was not a path that I expected or planned necessarily. And in fact, if you had told me when I was in college that, oh, Rob, you're going to be a professional speaker one day, I would have said, for sure, you need to, really think about what you're ingesting, because there's no way that's going to happen. I was terrified of public speaking, and I took a lot of classes in it, but not because I wanted to do it professionally. I did it because I didn't want to be afraid of it. Um,
Mm.
and it was interesting how, all my life, there's these different signposts when I look in the rearview mirror, and they were only apparent in hindsight, where it was clear that there was a path. I just didn't see it. It
Mm.
reminds me a bit of, I don't know if you ever saw the movie Michael Douglas and Kathleen Turner, God, what was
Romancing the Stone?
Romancing the Stone, thank you. When he's, they're running through the underbrush and he's got his machete and she's like, "Where are we going?" He's like, "I don't know. I think it's a path," And that's kind of how my life has felt in a lot of respects, but in a really good way. Then it goes back to that whole idea of everything I've ever done, I put 100% in. And, so like when I left advertising, became an options trader, there were a lot of people who were like, "Rob, that's amazing. How did you, it's so cool that you would take a cut of pay in half to go, pursue what you really love." But then interestingly, a year later, some of these same people and people I just met, were looking at me and they'd say things like, when I realized that that wasn't what I needed to be doing, and I wasn't exactly sure what I did need to be doing, it was before I wrote my first book. I was like, I was a bit lost at that point. And people, their immediate reaction was, "Well, I really hope you're going to be able to get your act together." And it was like, and I thought that's really fascinating, that all these people who were really super supportive when I took this chance and did this radical career change. And then when it didn't work out, it was like I became their excuse for not taking a risk. And
Wow.
I reject that notion completely. I don't want to be anybody's excuse for anything. The best advice I ever got when I was going through the inevitable ups and downs of, the emotional ups and downs of entrepreneurship and whatnot, was a psychologist who looked at me and he said, "Rob," he said, he basically heard me whining, and he was very, loud and clear in his assessment. He said, "When you have these moments, which you're having right now," he said, "you need to look in the mirror and say, 'I chose this.'" And there's a real power in that. And what I loved about that guy is I only ever saw him twice. He wasn't one of those people who was like, "Okay, well, this has been a good session. I'll see you next week at 10 o'clock." He wasn't trying to create dependence. He was giving me tools to move on. And in the two times that I met with him, he gave me those tools and he gave me those insights. And that was one of the best things anybody ever said to me, because he was exactly right. There is a reason that I chose to do this. And in that choosing, there's power. There's that, to be able to say, "Okay, maybe it isn't going exactly the way I had hoped it would right now in this very minute, but there's a reason I'm not in a corporate job, because that isn't the right thing for me." I had an open invitation to go back to Leo Burnett. I chose not to. And it's not that it isn't a great company. It is. And I learned a lot from it. And I had some amazing experiences, and they're really incredibly talented, funny people, but it wasn't the right place. The other thing that you talked about, that triggered This is the whole idea of also the attitude that you bring into it, because you had mentioned basically the focus, and the image that I had in my mind is I had heard that there was research that was done that basically said, I don't know how brain researchers figure this out, but they say we're bombarded by millions of stimuli in any given moment, but yet our brain can only focus on 100,000 bits of data at a time. We can't focus on millions. So we have a choice, which means that when we go into any given situation, and when I teach sales training classes, I always emphasize this, what are you telling yourself before you pick up the phone? What are you telling yourself before you go to meet with a customer? For example, if you're cold calling and you're trying to drum up new business and you're telling yourself in advance, I'm a pest and I'm bothering people, guess what? That's going to show up in how you present yourself. It's going to show up in your words. And there's a huge disconnect. One of my favorite things to coach people on is the difference between what they said and what somebody else heard. And I've watched literally multi-million-dollar deals get totally blown up because of the gap between what the person was saying is not what the prospect heard. I'll never forget one, I was coaching a team, and at the end of the presentation, the prospect, and this is a commercial banking group, and their deals are between, forget, like 50 and 200 million typically. And the prospect looked at the guy at the end and he said, I can't quite put my finger on it, but I'm not feeling confident moving forward. And I'm sitting here thinking, I can put my finger on it. It was the words that he used. Of course, I didn't say that in the moment. When I coached him on it after the fact, we talked about that. Some of those things you can't even recover from. But it's like the real thing is there's the stories that we're telling others, and what's the gap there? But there's also, what story are we telling ourselves? Because if we're telling ourselves, I'm a pest. One of the most powerful examples of this, by the way, I was working at Burnett, and I'll try to give you the short version of the story, but the chairman of Philip Morris at the time was a guy named Hamish Maxwell, and he wanted to see work in progress on the new Marlboro Medium campaign that my boss and I were, we were in charge of the 25 some creative teams that were working on that project. And when he says work in progress, guess what? That got translated by his underlings as they wanted to see, the equivalent of camera ready artwork. In other words, show us the ads that we could be putting on billboards and in magazines next week. This is in the early 90s when they could still advertise. And to the upper echelon at Leo Burnett, who didn't know how to say no, that was what that got translated to. But we'd only been working on the project for like 3 weeks. There was no camera ready artwork, and we're talking about Marlboro country, horses and vistas and cowboys and whatnot.
Sure.
So we need to go to these 25 creative teams and say, look, whatever you're thinking about, whatever you're planning, you have permission, you have an unlimited budget. Go to Utah, Wyoming, wherever you need to go, hire the horses, hire the cowboys, take the pictures. We have a meeting in New York next Friday, and this is on a Thursday night. Next Friday, we have a meeting in New York, and we need camera ready artwork for that. In other words, do 6 months worth of work in a week. Now, usually if you give a team an unlimited budget, they'd be really happy about that. But when the unlimited budget comes because they're being asked to do that amount of work in that shorter period of time, you got a lot of unhappy people. And so I was thinking that was the worst day of my life. It was not, but I was thinking that. And it was also my night to volunteer at the Children's Hospital. Now, usually, you'd stick around and you'd help the teams, but these 25 teams were not working together. They didn't know each other. So it was more of a situation of deliver the bad news and get out of the way, not a stay late and order pizza kind of thing. So I was like, all right, well, this is perfect night. I'll go to the hospital and it'll take my mind off it. It didn't really. But here's where the big lesson, the life lesson came. I'm feeling sorry for myself about what a horrible day I've had. The fact that I can't believe that I'm, 20 some years old and I'm the only one who seems to be able to say no to people. And I get up there and my supervisor says, hey, I need you to see Tommy up on 7. I really think you two are going to get along. And I said, fair enough. Now, ordinarily, I would have stopped and I would have said, hey, what do I need to know to safely interact, blah, blah, blah. I didn't do any of that because I was too in my own head. So I get up there to the 7th floor and the door is ajar and I can see into the room and he's a teenager and he's sitting on the bed and he's wearing street clothes because the hospital will let teenagers do that so they don't have to wear those awful hospital gowns. So I get his attention and I walk into the room and I looked at him and I said, hey, Tommy, I'm Rob. I'm one of the volunteers. And I started to give him my whole little spiel. And he looks at me And I'm looking at him and I look down and I realize that he's wearing a t-shirt from a Chicago punk rock band called Naked Ray Gun. Now I had had the misfortune of seeing Naked Ray Gun open for the Ramones, not long before that. And I didn't tell him I didn't like the band, but I said, no way. I said, I saw those guys open for the Ramones at the Aragon. And he looked at me and he goes, you were there? He's like, oh, I wanted to go, but he goes, it was an 18 and over and I couldn't get in. And we bonded immediately. Long story
Exactly.
short, yeah. So we had this amazing interaction. And at the end of the night, I go down. Oh, by the way, halfway through the interaction, the first life lesson came from him because he looked at me really casually in the middle of our thing because we didn't know what the diagnoses were. We didn't need to know, But in his case, he looked at me and he said that he told me he was waiting for a heart transplant. And I
Oh,
thought,
wow.
yeah, that's what I thought too, because I thought I was ashamed of myself. I really was, and it was embarrassing because I thought, here, I've been feeling sorry for myself and telling myself what a horrible day I'm having, when what I have is a deadline that next Friday will be replaced by another deadline. And here's a 17-year-old with a life and death issue who's taking life as it comes and doing this beautiful artwork in his room. And I thought something's really wrong with this picture. Sales
Wow.
lesson came at the end of the night when Jamie, my supervisor, looks at me. She's like, hey, how'd it go with Tommy? I said, oh, it was great. I filled her in on everything that happened. She looks at me. She's like, phew. I go, what do you mean, phew? She's like, he's been here for 3 weeks. He hasn't talked to anyone. He sent everyone away. Now, I'm here to tell you there's nothing special about me. What had happened was, and this goes back to that whole brain thing of what are you focusing on? She very wisely did not tell me what everyone else had experienced. Because if she had, I can tell you exactly what would have happened. It would have affected my physical presence. I would have been at the door. I would never have walked in confidently. I'd have been at the door and I would have said, hey, do you need anything? And he would have said likely no. And I would have said, okay, well, if you do, let your nurses know. And I would have been gone in under 10 seconds. Instead, a friendship developed. I saw him every week for the next couple of months while he waited for his heart, which he did ultimately
Wow.
get. And
Wow.
that would never, that friendship would never have happened had I been focused, because if I knew what other people had experienced, I would have been telling myself a story about that. And I would have misread, maybe he could have been sitting, he wasn't, but let's say he was sitting on the bed with his arms crossed, maybe he would have been cold in that moment, but my brain would have interpreted that as, oh, he's closed. He doesn't want me to be here. Any evidence that would have supported what, Jamie, had told me about what other people had experienced would have been what my brain would have been processing. But instead, she
Absolutely.
told me something totally different. She said, I really think you two are going to get along. So I literally never questioned that. She was only 24 or 25 at the time, but she was very wise to have that level of understanding about, what was going to change our interaction. And I'll never forget that because it was one of those things that it really does reinforce what you're talking about is, your brain is going to focus on, with your direction, what is it that's important or what's going to support its current conclusions, which is why
Yeah.
like later when I went through lymphoma, I was very careful about the words that I used. I never, you'll hear people talk about, they'll say that they have cancer. I never once used the word have because that's a possession. I can't take credit for this. My dear friend Jackie and another friend Chenoa were the ones who were very instrumental in my thinking and how important the words were and that attitude action sort of thing. But we talked about experiencing tumors. There's a huge difference because my belief from the very beginning was that they came with a gift. So I wasn't fighting anything. I was walking, as Jackie used to say, because she was going through cancer at the same time, we're walking with this. We're taking whatever lessons we need to learn and we're moving through it. And it was interesting because my dad, who was a doc at Northwestern in Chicago, he told me, he said, your diagnosis was a death sentence when I was in medical school. Now, here I am 9 years later, cured. They never once even used the word remission because they can cure it now. A lot of people were struck by the way that I handled that, in terms of not, the words that I used and the way that I approached it. And I'm not saying that this is true. This is my experience. This is, there's people who go through much worse diagnoses. You think about health on a spectrum of 0 to 100. cancer could legitimately take up about 93 spots on that. Lower ones being, curable and not that big of a deal, to the things where you've got hours and you better get your affairs in order. And to even use the same word to describe that does a massive disservice to people who are going through it. Yet, to someone who's never been through it, they may catastrophize on your behalf and visualize you checking out. One of the reasons I was so open about, what I went through was I didn't want people to visualize me checking out, because there's a real power in having people focus on the right things. And I had asked people, it was interesting, I'd asked people to visualize just the tumors dissolving and going away. And one woman, a friend that I'd gone to grade school with, talked about she had a vision while she was meditating of the tumors literally melting, which was interesting because that word had never been used. But then the next time that I was in the oncologist's office, he was talking about Rituxan, one of the drugs that I was on. And the way that it acts on the tumors is it literally melts them.
Wow. I'm thinking about this was early on, and at the phases where, the C word was way scarier than it is now. There was a boy with a inoperable brain tumor and, basically given not that long to live. And he visualized playing Pac-Man, right? And the Pac-Man internally was going to turned out that that's exactly what happened. And he was cancer-free after a while. So there's got to be something to how much our will and our framing of our narratives in the world actually do affect the material world. There's relationships that are far more than what meets the eye. Eastern approaches have been onto it for thousands of years, of course. The West, we got very enamored with ourselves, with how much we've learned in such a short period of time. So we have the illusion, like teenagers do, that we know so much. And then we don't know enough yet to know how little we know. But it does come down to the power of story. And that's one of the things I take away from what you shared there. I love that story with your experience with, I guess he's still a boy at 17, needing a heart transplant. And also the place where what you say has the impact, all these things. To me, all of that, what I was thinking, Rob, is that this underscores the power of passion and authenticity. So we have to be connected to the things that matter in a way that are really deep down to what really matters. And we can be chasing our tails and getting into these things. We started there. We started with that sort of false security of like, okay, I've taken my shoes off, everybody else has, so now I'm safe to get on the plane. Or the false security, like, okay, I got a paycheck, I'll get a paycheck next week, so I don't have to worry about my financial future. Or, it's better just to eat the crap burgers that I get at the office, and that's not going to do anything to me because I don't have to worry about that, or it doesn't matter as much. All these different things that steal our soul, really. I mean, it's our spirit that we're giving, right? All of that was very much in all the aspects of your stories there were threaded in there. So I absolutely love that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I wish I remember the exact quote, but I had heard recently Ricky Gervais, who's one of my favorite comedians, was
Oh, he's
talking
great.
about he's amazing, and he was talking about science, and his point was he said science is fact as we know it right now.
I have three younger brothers. The youngest one is a scientist. He works for the USDA. We wrote a novel together. And what I learned through that process and learned through him is that science is actually just a mindset. It's a mindset that says, I don't know, and I'm going to find out through this specific thing. It's a process. So I think that's very much in harmony. If you think, oh, the science tells us this, and now that's a fundamental stone that we can lean all our weight on without question, you're not a scientist.
Well,
You're a believer.
yeah, and I love that you were talking about Eastern versus Western, because my earlier experience on the medical side that was really eye-opening was I had been diagnosed right around the time that I left the Chicago Board of Trade, or actually while I was at the Chicago Board of Trade is when it happened. I was diagnosed with narcolepsy, which is sleep disorder.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And and of course, being the doctor or the son of a doctor, the first line of defense always was, go to the best neurologist in the world at Northwestern and do all that. And I went through all the sleep studies, and they came back and said, yeah, you have all the genes for narcolepsy and blah blah blah. And after all of these, drug trials and different things, that trials in the sense of testing them on me to see if it worked or was effective, their final conclusion was, you're going to be on Ritalin and Prozac for the rest of your life. And by the way, drink more coffee, which I'm thinking to myself, you may as well just throw up your hands and say, we don't know, because that's what
Exactly.
you're telling me. And my dad always said, he was super supportive of my alternative medicine pursuits, because he said, the Chinese and some of these other cultures have been doing this for thousands of years, in the rainforest and stuff. To think that we can't learn something from them is completely naive. And so I went on what turned out to be a 2-year quest to find a cure for narcolepsy, which Western medicine says there isn't one. Well, guess what? I found a 9th-generation Japanese healer in New York who cured me of narcolepsy. I don't have an issue with it anymore. That was a long journey. And that was actually the journey that led to the current book, because, my book, A Trek Within, because it was when I wrote that story and shared it, people contacted me. Nothing I had written professionally had touched people the way that did. And I still remember my friend Carolyn from high school, one of her comments on it was, she said, I've always wanted to believe this. And if it weren't coming from you, I probably still wouldn't. And she's like, thank you for opening my eyes. And that was what I realized more than anyone. She's probably the one who crystallized my sense of what my current mission is, which is, I'm not trying to start a new religion. I don't really, people can accept or not what I have to say. There are a lot of things that I was not raised to believe, but that I've come to embrace. The power of dreams, intuition, alternative medicine, psychics, even, intuitives, there's so many different things out there that have enriched my life in a million different ways. And it goes beyond what people, are raised to believe, past lives, even, as an example. And if you can learn something from, any of those sorts of things, take dreams. That's a powerful one. I had a dream that literally saved my life. And if I weren't in tune, I would never have paid attention. And so each chapter of the book covers, a different topic. So there's a chapter on dreams, there's a chapter on alternative medicine, there's a chapter on overcoming scarcity mentalities and things like that. But it all does come down to, what stories are we telling ourselves? What do we accept? If I accepted the story that Western medicine told me, I'd be in a very different place right now.
I want to hear more of that, but I had a couple things I want to. So the word that's coming to mind as you speak there, Rob, to me is the importance of humility, right? The importance to realize that what you think you know is a very small thing, and no matter how accomplished we are, how much we've learned, you have to be humble, because it's nothing compared to all there is to know, and all the and a human lifespan is a very short period of time compared to the all there is to know in the universe. And our all of our bandwidths, whether it be our eyesight, our hearing, our thought processing power, whatever we want to measure, is all very finite, very limited, and it only has meaning within the context of our social stories. For those reasons, it seems to me like the only appropriate thing is to be open and humble and being willing to learn. And that's as you share, that's the I think the lesson that probably people get from your book, it would be my guess, is one of them anyway, that would just be open. What do you think you know? Because if you, as soon as you shut, now that barrier is now no longer anything but a prison wall.
Exactly. Yeah, I love that. And humility is such a big piece of that, because would never have thought to use that word. It's a great word, but it's true, because you have to first step back and say, you know what, I don't know all the answers here, and I'm willing to consider a different perspective. If I hadn't been willing to do that at any number of those signposts along the way, I'd be in a very different place. And that's really my hope for the whole thing. As I said, I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything or whatnot, but the way I look at, that even that whole category, there's people, when I think about book buyers and people who are, willing to go in that direction or not, I would think of three broad categories. There's the people on one hand who know you couldn't pay them to read the book. There's nothing, fine, I get it. On the other end of the spectrum,
allergic to the written word.
exactly, yeah, or yeah, the topic, it's like, oh no, not going there. there's other people who, if you take, what people consider, the new age or spiritual category, there's, people in there who, and I'm one of them. It's not a question of should I buy that book or that book. It's more like I'm going to buy that book and probably that one too. But the ones that I was really hoping to reach were the people in the middle who were the ones who they haven't had a point of entry. They're open to it. They would consider it, but they haven't heard, from the right person. And, to me, when I look at even the authors in the category, the vast majority of them are women. The male authors in the category, down to the last one, are psychologists, which are their own special version of crazy. I'm not knocking them. They have some very good things to say, but there are, as far as I've ever seen, no former business people, or I mean, still a business person, but no, former like options traders in that category. It's a very different sort of
The
mission.
book is not a the book is not a fancy business card, in other words.
Not even, in fact, you could argue that, there's a lot of client, because I've worked with a lot of large global companies and banks and things like that. There's probably quite a few clients that I've worked with who might look at that and go, wow, he's actually stepped off the deep end this time. But again, that would be a limiting belief on their part, because I don't go into a sales training workshop, looking for converts to, open-mindedness about spirituality. It wouldn't even come up. But that's a separate thing that I do.
It seems to me like that bar, as far as those limiting beliefs that people might have about alternative paths, it seems to me like that is shifting a bit. And I wanted to get your view on that. It seems like people are more open than they used to be as it relates to, because one thing I think is faith in the institutions is falling. So just a quick story. Last week, my dad, both my parents are still alive. They live within a mile of where I live. They're in their 80s. And my dad left. She was making breakfast, came home. He couldn't wake her up. Takes her to the emergency room. They couldn't. She. Long story short, she lost that whole day. Can't remember a thing, which is not a good thing in your mid 80s to have that happen to you. Couldn't explain it. Did a whole battery of tests. They still couldn't explain it. They started a new medication for 2 days before that. Why are you putting this person who's in the 80s on that medication? Number one. Number two, why aren't you immediately thinking that that might be the problem since she just started some? So they go through this entire battery of tests just to come around. Well, I don't know. Must be this new medication. They took her off it. But it's that kind of experience where it happened more and more, where I think it's shaking the faith in sort of the status quo of the medical profession or the industries that are around it, and maybe opening people's minds. And I wanted to get your view as to whether that's a moving target from your viewpoint, Rob.
Yeah, I do think I'm heartened by the fact that there's more and more people who are open-minded, and that just people are changing. In all the years, for example, that I volunteered at Children's, I saw a complete evolution. Now, maybe part of it was what I was aware of, which you could make that case, and I wouldn't argue the point. But
Yeah.
where at the beginning, it just seemed like kids were kids, and they were doing their thing. The kids that I know now and that I've seen are at a different level spiritually in the way that they think about things. And for example, a friend of mine, his wife got into a car accident. She got T-boned at an intersection. The car flipped over, spun. Miraculously, nobody was hurt. They walked away from it. Uh,
Wow.
the next day, now her daughter was in the back seat in a car seat, and I think she was around 3 at the time. She was pretty little. And the next day, her daughter walked into the kitchen and she said, "Mommy, I want you to call the other driver." And she's like, "You do? What do you want me to say?" She said, "I want you to forgive him." Okay, forgiveness was not in my vocabulary as a 3-year-old. I'm quite sure of it. I wouldn't have even if you had told me what it meant, I still wouldn't have grasped it. And
We're
certainly
trying to
not.
figure out how to play interactively at that point.
Yeah, exactly. I'm really, concerned about, are you going to cut the crust off my jelly toast? Not, yeah. And she's not the only one. I have a niece and a nephew who are very spiritually in tune and whatnot. They were, the story that comes to mind is a quick one. My brother was driving down the street with them in the back seat, and they used to refer to my dad as Fancy Grandpa, which was actually a very funny nickname since he was anything but fancy. He had a plane at Pewaukee Airport, And as they were driving by Pewaukee Airport, now keep in mind, in Chicago, near this little airport, it's a little commuter airport for people who have small planes. You can't see the airport from the road. They were driving by, I don't know that they had ever even been on that street before. And they looked over and the two of them were like, oh, look, fancy grandpa, after he died.
Oh,
You know,
wow. Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
And my brother was stunned because again, they would have had no way of knowing that he had a plane, that he had, they were little. They were like, I mean, they're little now, and this was like 6 years ago. I think they were probably 3 and 5 or something at the time. But my point is that I do think people are evolving, and it's starting happily with kids. The kids are a different quality now than, not every one of them certainly, but many
Of course.
of them. They're just so much more in tune, from and emotionally intelligent. And so that does contribute, because if you're emotionally intelligent, you would be willing to be humble, to go back to your humility, because it takes I would say, a high level of emotional intelligence to admit when you don't know something, to admit when you're wrong, all that kind of stuff.
Well, that brings me to another question I had while you were laying some of your stories out, Rob, which is, I was thinking about the challenge of clarity, because you have, of course, the complexity problem we have, where we have the limited perceptive powers and the world is hard to figure. Therefore, our stories and our thoughts sort of make a closed loop where we see it to believe it and see it, and we kind of create these illusions in that way. So that's one problem of the clarity issue. And then the other thing is the feedback and noise from other people, and it's not just what you think, it's all the pressures that you get, right? So you're hearing conflicting things all the time, and you're being pulled this way, and if you think this, it's got this set of things, and you hear this other thing, it's got this set of things, and you almost have to pick, like that's one of the things that's so good about the wizarding world of
Sure.
Hogwarts and the Harry
Yeah.
Potter, where you sort of have to pick your sorting house, right? And it's there's kind of truth in that as far as how we go through life. We kind of have to pick our tribe, our venue, our way that we're going to do things. And so you get a bunch of goodies with that choice, and then you get a bunch of things that you're essentially squashing or saying no to or pushing away in some way. So these are the challenges as it relates to increasing and gaining clarity, right? So I was thinking about that, and what you pointed to with the kids who don't have, they're pre all of that. They don't have that noise, and so whatever's there, sensory speaking, they don't have the filter, right? It comes right to them, so they're able to perceive what we can't perceive because of all the crap that we got in the way, right? So, what's your
Yeah.
thought along those lines?
It reminds me of a guest you had on, I think her name was ST, who
Okay,
talked
ST
about,
Rappaport. Yeah,
yeah, the three different ways of thinking. And I love the point that she made about how a test isn't a very good measure, because you don't know, did they not understand the question? Did they understand the question and not know the answer? Or did they have an answer and they just couldn't articulate it? If I remember, that was one of the points that she made.
yeah.
And
Good
as
memory.
you were speaking, I was very much reminded of that, because I never really thought about it that way, but it's a really good point. Because if you didn't have a mentor or a coach or somebody who was giving you feedback, you might never realize that you were in one of those cycles of not interpreting things correctly, or whatever.
I
I
think
don't
we
know.
might all be in that cycle in one way or another. It's very difficult to avoid them all, right?
Well,
We can't see our
totally.
own
I mean,
blind spots.
yeah, I look at, I mean, there's, one of the stories that I shared in the book is this woman, Amber, who is a woman I had dated, and she is the one who got me out of my scarcity mentality.
Oh,
And I am absolutely convinced, as an example of something like, that is a disease every bit as bad as alcoholism or anything else, because it literally changes your thinking and it changes your perception. When she called me on it, like months after we had broken up. And she gave me this greatest gift I'd ever been given in terms of feedback. She pointed to some very specific things I had done, and I don't remember doing that. I remember the scenarios, but I don't remember doing the things that she said that I did. And I'm not one, even if I had been drinking, which I really wasn't, I wouldn't point to that anyway as an excuse, because I think it's lame. But it was, it was striking to me that I could be behaving in a very classless manner. I was being cheap. I'm not proud of that. It's just, the fact of what was going on. And when she gave me all these examples of things that I had done, it was really powerful. And I was struck by the fact that how could I not have been aware of how I was coming across to other people? How could I have been that blind? And it was interesting because then she said to me, and I'll never forget this part either. She said, the reason that we broke up is she said, you were the third guy in a row that I dated who had an issue around money. And she said, I didn't want to go there again. And and also she's like, I don't believe people can change. I'm here now. I didn't argue that last point with her, but I'm here to tell you people can change. I did change. In fact, it goes back to what you had asked at the beginning. The whole digital nomad thing would never have happened. I'd still be circling the drain financially had it not been for what the gift that she gave me in terms of the feedback of where was I screwing up and how was I not perceiving things correctly or whatever. Because the contradiction that she pointed out was that I had said to her that I wanted to be at the level, where my grandfather was in terms of being generous. Because after he died, we found out that he had put people through college that we don't even know who they were. Turns out he was probably the anonymous donor at the parish who donated the uniforms for all the kids who couldn't afford them. And I don't even think my grandmother knew stuff like that. We found all these notes after the fact. And I had commented while we were dating that I wanted to be, that level of generous. And she said, she started off her whole conversation saying, Rob, she said, remember that story you told me about your grandfather? I said, yeah. She goes, you are the exact opposite of that. And it was a gift, but I needed that because
Yeah.
a lot of people saw it, but she was the only one who had the courage to tell me.
There's reason to think that people can't change because it is sort of rare to have people actually get out of their tracks. I always think of the movie Overboard. Remember with Goldie Hawn?
Oh, I didn't see that one. I'll have to watch that.
That's one where it was a good enough movie where they actually redid it again, and of course the remake sucked compared to the original. Kurt Russell and Goldie Hawn. She's an elite, rich, spoiled woman, treats the poor carpenter that she hires to do a project, Kurt Russell, poorly. She ends up an accident, loses her memory, and to get his payment back, he's like, okay, she's going to serve me, and pretends that they've been together, and he fools her all this way. Anyway, not to spoil the plot, but she ends up remembering eventually and going back to her life. And then, do you remember Roddy McDowall, the actor Roddy McDowall?
Yeah.
Yeah. He plays her, I guess, butler or main servant guy. And everybody's wondering why she's so different and will she ever be back? And she asks him, am I crazy? Is there something, I'm going to start crying. Is there something wrong with me? And, his performance in that moment is memorable to me. It's like, it's absolutely perfect. He says, oh no, he said, most of us go through life with blinders on, knowing only what we've been appointed to, only those things that we happen to be experiencing. He said, you have had a chance to remove them for a moment. What you choose to do with that information is up to you. And so wow. I just thought that, I'm crying about it right now because this movie is 40 years old. So it's like, it's one of those things that just keeps with you because it's so poignant. And we go through our lives with our blinders, and it's that confusion, the lack of clarity. It's the lack of authenticity out of fear. It's all the stuff we've been talking about, Rob. And, you can tell that's what I'm passionate about because it doesn't have to be that way. So that woman that was your ex-girlfriend that was courageous enough to speak with you, she's a gem. She's a gem. That people like that are gems. Now, she's wrong about the change, but she's not that wrong because that is what people generally do. It's just that it's possible. And she lost sight of that particular thing.
Yeah, you can't force people to change. Like she couldn't have willed me to change. It had to come from me.
She did something that caught her. She did. She basically countered her own argument.
That's true. I hadn't thought about that. That's a really good point. Because if she didn't think that there was a point, why would she even bring up the conversation? Yeah, because it's not like we're trying to get back together. By the way, thank you for sharing that story. That was I got a chill when you were telling me about that movie. That's really powerful.
Yeah, and it's a comedy. It's a light thing. No one would think like, okay, this is you're going to get these life lessons. But that's what I love about the long form drama and performances like that, music, where you can get condensed wisdom, like really that you hold on to. I love that.
Well, it's even like the end scene in Harry Potter with Dumbledore when he's like, "Is this real?" And you know
Yes.
that
Yeah. Oh, another. Oh, beautiful, beautiful
yeah,
example.
it's just an amazing scene. And we'll ignore that my resemblance to Voldemort for a moment, but uh, the that was pointed out to me by one of my couch surfers, and I had to laugh because there's a picture I have of him and me side by side, which not like it's a split thing. I wasn't with him,
That's
and
fantastic.
it's undeniable. But yeah, and I love that you find the wisdom in those things because there's so many, and it's part of the awareness, that these lessons and these gifts are out there. The question is, are we open to even seeing them? We're bombarded by it constantly, but if we're not paying attention to it, like the dreams or whatever, that's the kind of stuff that's going to make the difference. Because if you ignore something and you're like, oh well, like if I had ignored the dream that saved my life, I would not be here right now, literally.
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
and you just don't want to go. My life is so much richer because I am paying attention to this stuff. In a way, it puts a lot more responsibility on you because you are paying attention, and that means that, going back to your thing, you can't just have an attitude of, oh, this is important. You have to take action on it.
Yep.
If it is important and you're noticing something, okay, what are you going to do about it? Are you, is it time for you to change? Am I going to put my head in the sand and just keep going on my merry way and keep making all
Well,
the same?
that's where our agency is, right? If you just think about it, you've got your hands tied behind your back, right? So, or if you just do and you don't think and look at your assumptions, same thing. You just keep going. That you're like a wind-up toy, right? To get our full power, we have to pay attention to what. And the other thing I was going to say about the clarity piece is also we spend a lot of our energy on things that we have no control over. So that's a huge, huge sink of a lot of people's, especially we're in we happen to be speaking in an election season. It's like people are spending a lot of energy on things that they can't do a whole lot about. And it's going to only get worse before it gets better. I kind of wish people would just focus on the things that are going to make a bigger difference for them personally. I find myself thinking that a lot. The other thing I almost said earlier, that is a good example of just how amazingly narrow our focus can be. You might have seen this, Rob. The video where you're told to count the number of times that the people pass the basketball.
Yes,
And
yes.
yep.
Yeah,
And then you watch the video and then you say, okay, it's 32. And then the guy says, did you see the gorilla? It's like, what gorilla? And then you look it back and then a guy in a gorilla suit walks by and you never saw it. Right.
yeah.
It's like, it's amazing how narrowly focused our vision is. And it's in all aspects of our life. It's the same way. And so that's all of this points towards why we really need to be in the open, creative, authoring sort of exploring, right? Having fun. That's another thing I love about your lifestyle, right? It's conducive to the exploration. Every day can be sort of a new adventure. You didn't grow up in this area. So the problem with, I mean, it's nice to know your area. It's wonderful. But then you become sort of nose blind to all the wonderfulness about the area. And it just becomes this sort of gray thing that you're living in because you let the couch surfers come in. It's like, oh my gosh, is this? So you get to see it through their eyes, right? And it's that novel because our brains really tie into the novel, right? They don't tie into things that we become familiar with.
Absolutely. You just, one of my favorite moments was there was a group of couch surfers. I forget where they were from, but they went to Wrigley Field to watch a baseball game. They had never been to a baseball game. And they came back and I said, oh, how's the game? And they said, it was fun, but, we just didn't understand it. And of course, my immediate reaction was, I said, it's, there's a lot of rules. It can be a bit hard to follow. And they're like, no, it wasn't that. I said, well, what do you mean? They said, well, we're sitting in the stands and we're watching people and they're ordering hot dogs and they're talking and they're turned around and they're looking at each other and they don't seem to be watching the game at all. yet something would happen and everybody would jump up at the same time. And all we could think is, how did they know to do that? That is like the most brilliant observation of a baseball game I think I've ever heard, because it's so true. It's like nobody's paying any attention, and then bam, like I would be willing to bet you that, and I hadn't thought about it until they mentioned it, but probably 70% of the people who are screaming are wondering what they're screaming about, and trying to get caught up on whatever just happened because they were turned around ordering a hot dog.
It might just be, I mean, to me, that kind of thing it really goes down to our very base fundamental wiring that comes into play as we are very young kids. The good versus bad. So that's our first moral compass is I'm a good boy, I'm a bad boy. And we don't think much more beyond that. When everybody's cheering, it's first of all, it's probably good for the Cubs,
Yeah.
right? So that's kind of enough to activate that circuit to say, yay. I mean, and that's kind of that part of ourselves only needs that, doesn't need any more than that. Right. It's kind of
Yeah.
funny that way.
It is. It also reminded me of, I remember, I'm having a vision of it right now. There was a picture in one of my I was a psychology undergrad, and they had a picture of this group of people, and they were, there was like one guy who was like, and all these different expressions. And the idea was all about context, because the question that they were asking is, what's happening in this picture? And all you could see is all these different people with these different reactions. And some people looked really angry, and some people looked really, confused. And some people, it was, I remember looking at this picture, and I still can vividly remember the angry guy. And I was like, I have no idea what's going on. And it turns out they were at a sporting event. Yeah, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's true. But when you don't look at it, because there weren't any visual cues that they were sitting in stands necessarily, just like a whole bunch of people. It was really fascinating because you could create all these stories about what different people are thinking and feeling, and you probably wouldn't be right.
Well, what we do there, of course, is project our story into there, right? Everything's through our lens, right? So we
Yeah.
see what we believe to be real, and then that is what ends up being true. Yeah, I always think about this like, when you're shopping for a vehicle, right? So if you're shopping for a Camry or an Accord or Telluride, whatever it might be, as soon as you decide that's what you're shopping for, guess what you're going to see all over the place, right? And it's not like the equation changed. You're the one who changed. It is within our power to adjust these things, and we can profoundly affect our life circumstances in so doing. So let's kind of wrap things up and bring it home a little bit, Rob. Been talking a long time. I get the sense you and I could keep going pretty much all day, and I'd love it, but people are going to have a limited time to listen to us. So let's kind of bring it back to your book and maybe how people might get a hold of that and what you'd like people to understand about what the value equation is there.
Oh, sure. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, the book is called The Trek Within: Embracing Unexpected Truths. If you go to atrekwithin.com, you can download a free chapter. You can download part of the chapters from the audiobook. I was amazed that about half the people were still in the tens of copies. This is not like a huge seller at this point, but it will be. But about half of them have been audio, which is really interesting to me. I would not have expected that. But the book is, every chapter covers a different topic, and it's all about, and by the way, it's not just my stories. One of the greatest gifts that I got through the editing process was an editor who said, because she was really intrigued by the topic, and she said, do you know other people who've had these experiences? And I said, well, sure. And so now the book has, I think there's 70 or 80 people who have generously shared their stories. So either in part or in full, where, I mean, there's stories of vanishing twins, of, angelic encounters with dead relative kind of things. There's just a lot of really cool stuff. And if you're open-minded, and you don't have to read the whole book. If you're not interested in alternative medicine, but you are interested in dreams, then read that chapter. One colleague of mine, he said he usually devours books. He said, with yours, he said, I literally read through it. And he said, because at the end I have a little section on putting it in action, and so questions to think about if you really want to apply this in your own life. And he said, I worked through it over a course of weeks. He said, because I really did want to absorb it. And he said that was his favorite part about the whole thing, was that it wasn't just to read it, okay, how can you apply it? If you're talking about synchronicities, synchronicities are a lot like your car example. Are there, you're going to notice them more if you pay attention to them. And it's in paying attention to them where the magic is. A friend of mine calls them God winks, and I love that idea. It's just sort of like sometimes it might just be the universe saying, "Hey, you're exactly where you need to be. Don't sweat it," which is pretty cool if you think about it.
I love that term, God winks. That's fantastic. If you're paying attention, it's all the time, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
That's good.
Yeah,
Well, I'm looking forward to getting my copy, and I like to do it that way. I've always got a few books going. Some books you just tear right through. Other books, they might be, very dense and it's hard to tear through, or other ones where you savor over time and they have, like yours is. I absolutely am very much looking forward to that, Rob. So we'll have to
yeah.
circle back. And once I get through it, I'll probably have a whole nother set of things I want to talk about with you. So maybe we
I
can
would
do this
love
again.
that. Yeah, I would love
That'd
that.
be
I would
cool.
love to continue the car. Yeah, and as my friend Jackie said, she never said goodbye. She'd always say "to be continued," which I
There you
love.
go. I like that too. I like that too. Part of my journey. I started this podcast just me talking. Right. I wanted to talk about what the power journey was, and what I've seen, and talk about maybe some of the topical things that relates to looks through the various. You can see this chart behind me
Yeah,
that has 16 components to it that I think kind of light the way for people to see a more clear path within. I look at it as a tool, right? A flashlight, a map, a compass to orient as to, okay, how can I get more of my power? So I spent maybe 75 episodes or so. I had one or two guests, and then I switched to having guests. And I wanted to have conversations, but I really, really love this because now I feel like you and I are new friends.
yeah.
We may, who knows how much our paths will intersect in the future, but I feel like if I happen to be in the town you're in, I call you up. Chances are good we'd probably go out and have a coffee or beer together, kind of thing. And I love that. I just feel like it shrinks the world.
Absolutely. No, this has been a real gift. I'm grateful to Brigham for making the introduction because it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you and a privilege to be on your show. So fantastic.
Well,
And,
thank
and, and I do believe that, exactly what you said, whether it's in person at a coffee shop or another virtual meeting or all of the above, I'm open to it. It'd be great.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. Appreciate it, Rob.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom.
Rob, thanks again for being my guest today. I'm so glad that Brigham Avery put us together. And I feel like we're going to have a lot more future discussions because we can keep going, going, going. And I love it when that happens. So thank you again. Um, in the manner we do here on I Have Power, I just want to take a moment to summarize the wisdom that you've shared with us today. Uh, First of all, I wasn't really aware of the couch surfing community, so I'm going to ask you more about that and find out more about that too. I think that might be a great way to expand our horizons in the way that you described. That was fantastic. I love the quotes that you shared with us early on in the discussion. When you take the first step, the universe meets you more than halfway. That was that's a good piece of wisdom, and that's very encouraging and optimistic. And I know that I've experienced that in my walk through life, and maybe you have too. The other thing is when you leap, the net will appear. So that's another kind of piece of wisdom that says, have faith, have courage, move forward boldly, that kind of thing. Your life story, such as we got there, was a little different, right? So you took an unexpected path, went down one kind of path, maybe circling around the business world of transactions and options training is money and predicting the future and sort of the hard and fast aspect of the world that way. But then we're able to sort of translate over to, we'll call it the more humble way. We talked about that, where you're open to a greater reality, alternative methods to get to a solution. And your stories along those lines were very inspirational to me. Um, you know, uh, you mentioned like, what are you telling yourself, right? So, like, I think that's perfect. Whether we're selling in a situation or we're kind of selling a lot whenever we're trying to influence somebody, right? We might not be selling them a product or a service, but we might be trying to help them in a way that see a new thing. So in that sense, our own power is related to what we're telling ourselves. Are we really helping them, or is it some other aspect of our story? And that kind of introspection is super powerful, and I appreciate our focus there. Talked a little bit about clarity and some of the challenges that are in the way there. One thing you said I'm going to remember a lot is scarcity mentality. Scarcity mentality is a disease every bit as bad as alcoholism. And so that means that, that we are very debilitated whenever we are thinking that we can't, or we shouldn't, or that we're sitting there afraid of what might happen. And if it was simple, it wouldn't be a problem, right? Because there are circumstances where if you take a risk and you miss, then it could be bad. Not everything is, roses and rainbows. So it makes it a little confusing, but the bottom line is we do better, right? So how do we know we're doing better? Well, the other thing you said about the God winks, right? So we know we're doing better when we look for those little synergistic things, whether it be the net appearing in a way, or the universe meeting us more than halfway, or little synchronous things that happen, synchronicity, or things that we never would have anticipated. You told the story about closing the door on one job, and the very next day, boom, there was a call from past client, and that sets you up. So you hear that all the time, right? It's a common thing. So there's more to it than meets the eye. Thanks again very much for all of what you shared with us. That's fantastic stuff. I look forward to reading A Trek Within and getting some of the stories that you have to share. So thank you once again, and thank you for listening to the iPower podcast. This has been the Eye of Power podcast with Tom Dardick. I'd like to thank you for listening. I'd also like to thank my brother, Scott Dardick, for the music and his music production. If you'd like to reach me, simply email Tom at dardickcommunications.com